Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Secrets channel. Tonight we step quietly into a winter evening more than 1,000 years ago, where the air over Heian-kyo, the city you now know as Kyoto, feels so sharp it almost rings like a bell when you breathe. You can see your breath drift away in pale clouds dissolving into darkness scented faintly with wood smoke and damp earth. The ground beneath your sandals is stiff with frost, and somewhere nearby, a shutter slides closed with a soft wooden clack, the ancient equivalent of someone saying, "That's enough outside for today." You pull your sleeves closer around your hands and immediately realise something important. There is no central heating, no insulation, and definitely no heated blanket waiting for you. You are, from a modern perspective, spectacularly unprepared. In fact, you probably won't survive this, at least not without learning very quickly how people here turned ingenuity into warmth. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, share your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where in the world people are listening from while we wander through another one together. Now dim the lights. You stand at the edge of a wide avenue laid out according to Chinese geomantic principles, because the capital of Heian-kyo, founded in 794, was deliberately modelled after Tang Dynasty Chang'an in both layout and philosophy, a well-established historical fact that shaped everything from street grids to seasonal rituals. Yet despite this grand urban planning, winter here is intensely personal, almost intimate. The cold is not fought with massive infrastructure. It is negotiated with daily habits. A breeze slides through the city unimpeded by the buildings, and that's your first surprise. Houses here are not fortresses against the weather. They are light, wooden, breathable structures. You can hear them beams creak gently, paper, screens rustle and wind, threads its way through seams as if invited. To you accustomed to sealed windows and double glazing, this feels like an architectural mistake, but to the people living here it is balance. Japan's climate is paradoxical. Summers are humid and oppressive. Winters, though shorter, can be piercingly cold, especially in inland basins like Kyoto, where icy air settles overnight. Buildings evolved primarily to release heat and moisture rather than trap warmth. The solution to winter, therefore, was not to redesign the house each year, but to redesign behaviour. You pad along a narrow path toward a residence. Gravel crunches softly beneath your feet, each step deliberate in the stillness. There is a smell of cedar, clean, resinous, calming. Somewhere inside you hear muted voices and the faint crackle of charcoal. That sound, subtle as it is, already tells you this culture's relationship with heat will be careful, controlled, and always aware of risk. Fire, after all, is both salvation and catastrophe in a city made largely of wood and paper. One delightful historical oddity survives in diaries from court nobles. Some aristocrats complained less about the temperature itself and more about ink freezing in their brushes during early morning writing sessions. Imagine being personally offended not by frostbite but by calligraphy becoming inconveniently crunchy. It's a small human glimpse into how normalised the cold could feel. As you approach the house, you notice the engawa, that narrow wooden veranda wrapping around the structure like a buffer zone. You step onto it and the wood feels cold but not hostile. This transitional space is intentional. It slows your entry, allowing mud, snow and wind to pause before reaching the interior. Even psychologically, you are being eased from outside to inside, from exposure to shelter. You slide open a door lighter than you expect and enter a room that is neither fully warm nor entirely cold. It's something in between a pocket of moderated air. This is your first lesson. Warmth in ancient Japan is rarely about raising the temperature dramatically. It is about creating microclimates, small envelopes of comfort within a larger, cooler world. You resist the urge to look for a blazing fireplace. There isn't one. Instead, warmth will gather low, slow and close to the body. The floor beneath you is tatami woven from rush grass, faintly springy, and carrying a sweet dry scent like sun-bleached hay. Tatami has insulating qualities, not enough to heat a room, but enough to soften the cold rising from the ground. You sit and immediately understand that life here happens near the floor, because the heat, when it exists, stays there. Outside, a crow calls once sharply, then goes quiet. Winter soundscapes are sparse, without insects or summer rain, and every noise feels deliberate. The settling of beams, the whisper of fabric, the gentle shifting of ash somewhere deeper in the home. You begin to sense that surviving winter here is not dramatic. There are no heroic blizzards being battled, no roaring hearths conquering the elements. Instead, there is attentiveness, small adjustments, a cultural acceptance that cold is not an enemy to defeat, but a season to accommodate. Scholars continue to debate whether this architectural openness was driven more by climate necessity or by aesthetic philosophy rooted in Shinto ideas of impermanence and connection to nature. The answer may be both. Living with the environment rather than sealing it out shaped everything that follows in this long, quiet winter story. You flex your fingers and watch another faint breath cloud appear even indoors, and yet you don't feel miserable. Not exactly. The human body adapts quickly when expectations change. Wrapped properly, seated properly, eating properly, you would find this entirely livable. That is the secret you are about to uncover over the coming hours. Warmth here is not a single invention. It is a network of choices, materials, posture, timing, clothing, fire, food, and community, all layered like robes. For now, you sit in this half-warm, half-cool room, listening to charcoal settle into its slow glow, realizing that winter in ancient Japan is less about fighting the cold and more about learning how to coexist with it. The longer you remain inside, the more you notice that this house does not behave like the buildings you are used to. It breathes. A faint current of air slips along the floor, rises gently and disappears through the upper spaces near the roof. Nothing is sealed. Nothing is airtight. At first, this feels like a flaw, the kind of thing that would send a modern home inspector into a state of dramatic distress. Yet here, this constant exchange between inside and outside is deliberate. Traditional Japanese houses are built from wood bamboo paper and earth materials that respond quickly to humidity and temperature. Winters may be cold, but summers are long, wet and heavy. A sealed structure would trap moisture rot from within and become unbearable by July. So the architecture evolved for the worst season, not the coldest one. That is a key historical reality recognised by architectural historians who study vernacular housing across the archipelago. You run your hand along a wooden pillar. It is smooth but not polished to perfection. The grain is alive beneath your fingertips, holding a faint trace of forest scent. Wood stores less heat than stone, but it also releases cold less aggressively. It moderates rather than dominates. The house is not trying to be warm, it is trying not to be painfully cold. The walls, if you can call them walls, are movable screens. Some are sliding panels made of opaque paper stretched across wooden lattices. Others are heavier shutters that can be closed at night. During the day, they allow light to enter freely, reducing the need for lamps, which would require precious fuel. At sunset, they are rearranged to create smaller interior zones. Instead of heating an entire building, people reduce the space they must warm. You watch as one section is closed off, transforming a broad room into a compact living area. This is climate controlled by choreography. Space itself becomes adjustable clothing for the house. An unexpected detail recorded in several classical diaries is that residents sometimes hung extra layers of fabric or even spare garments along interior edges during especially cold nights. It was a bit like turning your hallway into a closet fort. Not elegant by modern design standards, but undeniably practical. These temporary barriers slowed drafts and created pockets of retained body heat. You begin to realise how much of winter survival here depends on flexibility. Western medieval buildings often relied on thick masonry to resist cold. In contrast, Japanese homes relied on changeability. Rooms expand and contract according to need, season and activity. Architecture behaves more like furniture than fortress. The floor plan also reflects social rhythm. During the day, spaces remain relatively open to capture sunlight, which acts as a natural heater. Even weak winter light contributes a surprising amount of warmth when allowed to spread across tatami mats. By evening, the same spaces are compressed, concentrating both people and whatever heat source they share. Some researchers have suggested that this constant reshaping of living space influenced social intimacy, encouraging families to cluster together more closely in winter months. Others are less convinced, arguing that documentary evidence is too fragmentary to prove emotional effects. The discussion remains unresolved, but the physical closeness is undeniable. Warmth gathers where people gather. You shift position and hear the faint whisper of straw beneath the tatami. These mats are not simply decorative flooring. They're layered construction traps, air creating mild insulation. Not enough to rival a modern heated floor, of course, but enough to prevent the kind of bone-deep chill that stone surfaces can produce. Sitting, kneeling and sleeping all happen here, so comfort at ground level matters enormously. Another adaptation appears above you. The ceiling is relatively high, allowing smoke from indoor fires to disperse without suffocating the occupants. At the same time, this height keeps the coldest air stratified above the living zone. It is a subtle balance between ventilation and retention. Nothing is wasted. Even emptiness has purpose. Outside, the wind picks up briefly and you hear it move through bamboo groves with a sound like distant surf. Inside, the house answers with a faint rattle, not resisting but yielding. Flexibility protects it from storms, earthquakes and seasonal strain. The same openness that lets cold enter also prevents structural damage. Survival here is always multi-layered. There is also a psychological dimension. When you cannot completely shut out winter, you stop expecting to. The boundary between indoors and outdoors becomes softer. You remain aware of the season rather than insulated from it. Many classical poems describe this sensation, linking awareness of cold with appreciation of transience, a cultural value that later thinkers would call mano-ono, know aware the gentle sadness of passing thing. You notice now that no one is rushing to eliminate every draft. Instead, they adjust clothing posture and activity. Warmth is something you carry and cultivate, not something the building supplies automatically. A curious note from one provincial record describes households placing smooth river stones near fires, then wrapping them in cloth to create primitive hand warmers. This small trick shows how people extended heat without burning extra fuel. It is an almost improvised technology, simple yet effective, like carrying a piece of the hearth with you. Experts continue to examine whether such practices were widespread or highly local, since surviving evidence varies region by region. Still, the idea captures the mindset of the time. Heat was precious, portable when possible, and never taken for granted. You sit quietly, feeling the layered logic of the space around you. The house is not failing to keep you warm. It is inviting you to participate in the process. Every closed screen, every mat, every shared corner is part of a system that depends as much on human behaviour as on carpentry. And as the faint glow of evening settles in, you sense that the true centre of warmth is not the structure itself. It is wherever people choose to gather next. You are guided almost instinctively toward the heart of the home, a square opening set into the floor. At first glance it looks modest, even underwhelming, but as you kneel closer you feel a steady bloom of warmth touching your hands and face. This is the irori, the sunken hearth, and everything in the household seems to orbit around it. The irori is not a fireplace in the Western sense. There is no tall chimney, no dramatic mantle. Instead, it is a carefully contained pit, lined with ash and sand where charcoal burns slowly and predictably. A suspended hook hangs above it, adjustable in height, ready to hold a kettle or cooking pot. Heat, food and light all emerge from this one place. In historical records from the medieval period onward, the irori appears again and again as the literal and symbolic centre of domestic life. You settle beside it and the difference is immediate. The rest of the room remains cool, but here close to the coals, warmth gathers in gentle layers. It does not blast outward, it invites you inward. The design encourages proximity. People sit near one another not just for conversation, but because distance means cold. A faint scent rises from the charcoal, clean and almost sweet, lacking the sharp smoke of raw wood. That is intentional. Japanese charcoal makers refined their craft over centuries, producing fuel that burned hotter and with less smoke, an important adaptation in homes without chimneys. This refined charcoal, often made from oak, became a valued commodity carefully prepared in earthen kilns. You watch someone use long chopsticks to adjust a piece of glowing charcoal, turning it slightly so it burns evenly. There is no rush. Fire here is managed with patience, almost like tending a garden. An intriguing anecdote preserved in folk tradition claims that experienced householders could judge the quality of charcoal simply by listening to it. Good charcoal barely whispered as it burned, while inferior batches cracked or spat. Whether this skill was truly widespread or later romanticized is difficult to confirm, but it reveals how attentive people were to the smallest sensory details of their heat source. You extend your hands over the irori. The warmth reaches your palms first, then slowly seeps into your sleeves. Because the heat rises, those seated closest benefit, most creating an unspoken geography of comfort. Elders honoured guests or young children often occupied the warmest positions. Social structure and temperature quietly overlapped. Some historians interpret seating arrangements around the hearth as reflections of hierarchy embedded in everyday routine. Others caution that practical considerations may have mattered more than symbolism. The question remains open, but either way, warmth and relationship were physically intertwined. The irori also shaped the soundscape of winter evenings. You hear the soft simmer of a pot and the occasional settling of ash. The murmur of conversation kept low to preserve calm. Without roaring flames, there is space for stillness. This subdued environment likely contributed to the contemplative quality often associated with traditional Japanese interiors. You notice something else. The hearth is level with the floor, not raised. This allows those seated on tatami to interact with it naturally without chairs or style. Heat meets the body where it already rests. Everything about the design reinforces a low posture, conserving energy and keeping warmth close. Above the ceiling darkens gradually from years of exposure to smoke that drifts upward and filters through the roof. This slow staining of the wood actually helped preserve it, acting as a natural sealant against insects and moisture. What looks like discoloration is also a form of maintenance. A kettle begins to hum softly as water approaches boiling. Hot drinks and soups will soon follow, extending the hearth's influence from the outside of the body to the inside. Heating and nourishment are never separated here. They are part of the same cycle. You shift slightly closer, noticing how everyone else does the same in small increments, almost unconsciously tracking the warmth. There is no thermostat to adjust, only human instinct. When the fire weakens, someone adds another piece of charcoal. When it grows strong, they spread the embers apart. Balance is constant, subtle, ongoing. In some regions, families carried embers from one home to another to help neighbours start their fires on particularly cold mornings. The gesture was practical but also communal, a quiet acknowledgement that warmth could be shared as readily as food or conversation. Researchers still explore how these daily practices influence broader patterns of cooperation in pre-modern villages. Direct evidence is scarce, yet the material culture strongly suggests that managing heat required collaboration and attentiveness. The irori glows steadily now, casting a soft amber light that reflects off the paper screens and wooden beams. Shadows gather gently at the edges of the room. You realise that winter survival here is not about conquering the cold in one dramatic act. It is about sustaining a small controlled sun within the home, one that asks for care but gives back comfort in return. You sit with that warmth spreading slowly through you, understanding why this humble square of coals became the emotional anchor of the household. Because in a season defined by chill, this was where life gathered, lingered, and endured together. As you continue to sit beside the irori, you begin to understand that the true hero of this quiet winter scene is not the fire itself, but what feeds it. The small black pieces glowing in the ash are charcoal, and in ancient Japan this material was not just fuel. It was a carefully engineered resource, the result of skill, patience, and an intimate knowledge of wood. Unlike freshly cut timber, which burns quickly and produces thick, choking smoke, charcoal has already undergone transformation. Wood is slowly heated in low oxygen conditions inside earthen kilns, a process that removes moisture and volatile compounds. What remains is almost pure carbon. The result burns hotter, steadier, and far cleaner. This was essential in homes where ventilation depended on open roofs and drifting air rather than chimneys. Archaeological evidence from early kiln sites confirms that charcoal production was already widespread by the Nara and Heian periods, supporting both domestic life and metalworking industries. You imagine the labour behind each glowing ember. Winter comfort begins far from the house in forested hills, where woodcutters selected the right trees, often varieties of oak or evergreen species that produce dense, high-quality charcoal. The logs were stacked with precision, sealed under layers of earth, and tended for days as they slowly transformed. It was less like building a fire and more like baking something enormous and invisible. There is a faint elegance in this unseen preparation. Warmth here is delayed gratification. A curious regional tale speaks of charcoal makers offering small prayers before sealing their kilns, asking the fire to behave properly while they could not see it. Whether this was widespread custom or local folklore is difficult to verify, but it reflects the uncertainty of the process. Too much oxygen and the wood turned to ash, too little heat and it remained useless. Success required experience passed down through generations. Back inside you notice how sparingly the charcoal is used. No one piles it high. A few pieces are enough. Fuel must last through long nights and uncertain resupply. Conservation becomes instinctive. Even ash is saved, sometimes reused to bank embers or insulate new coals. The smell remains soft, almost calming, lacking the harshness you might expect from fire. This cleaner burn helped reduce indoor soot and allowed families to stay close to the heat without constant irritation. It also made charcoal portable. Small braziers could carry these coals safely, spreading warmth beyond the hearth. Economic records from later centuries show that high-grade charcoal became an important trade good transported into cities by boat and cart. Its value rose during colder months when demand for reliable heating increased. Fuel was not just gathered casually, it was part of a seasonal economy. You watch as another piece is placed gently onto the embers. There is an art to positioning it so that it catches without flaring. The glow deepens rather than brightens, like a steady breath instead of a shout. This slow release of heat defines the atmosphere of the entire room. Some scholars suggest that the Japanese preference for controlled, enduring warmth rather than large open flames influenced aesthetic values that later appeared in tea ceremony culture. Others believe the connection is overstated, noting that practical necessity alone could explain the technology. The relationship between survival and philosophy remains an area of thoughtful disagreement. You hold your hands out again, noticing how the warmth feels different from modern heating. It is directional. One side of your body is warm, the other still cool. Instead of adjusting a thermostat, you adjust yourself. You lean in, you rotate slightly, you become part of the system. Even the tools reflect this precision. Long-handled tongs allow careful movement of coals. Ash is smooth to regulate airflow. Our thing is random. Fire is guided, not unleashed. There is also an awareness of danger. Charcoal produces invisible gases, and while people of the time did not understand the chemistry, they understood the risks through experience. Rooms were never completely sealed. Airflow, however chilly, remained essential. The same architectural openness that lets in winter also protects life. You begin to see how every decision balances comfort and caution. Too much fire invites disaster, too little invites suffering. The ideal lies somewhere in between, maintained hour by hour. Outside night settles fully. The temperature drops and frost begins forming silently on rooftops. Inside the irori continues its patient work, each charcoal piece releasing stored sunlight from the tree it once was. It is warmth borrowed from seasons long past, returned now in measured portions. And as you watch the steady glow, you realize that winter survival in ancient Japan depended not only on enduring the cold, but on mastering the quiet science of making fuel last. You begin to notice that the people around the hearth are not dressed for the cold in the way you might expect. There are no thick coats, no single heavy garment designed to block winter entirely. Instead, each person wears layers. Soft robes overlap one another, collars folded with care, sleeves draping in quiet folds. Warmth here is built gradually, cloth over cloth, like adding more paper to a lantern to deepen its glow. The kimono, which you may think of as a formal or decorative garment, is in this context a practical system of insulation. Multiple layers trap air between them, and that trapped air becomes the true source of warmth. air when held still resists the transfer of heat away from the body. This principle is well understood today, but ancient Japanese clothing achieved it through experience rather than scientific explanation. Historical clothing records show that people often wore several underrobes called kasode beneath their outer layers during colder months. You try to imagine putting them on, first a light inner robe, then another, perhaps padded slightly, then the outer garment tied securely with a sash. The weight is not oppressive, but it is reassuring. The fabric moves with you, adjusting as you sit closer to the fire or step briefly into the night air. Unlike tailored winter coats, these layers can be rearranged easily, loosened indoors, tightened outdoors. The materials themselves matter deeply. Silk used by the aristocracy is surprisingly effective at holding warmth while remaining breathable. Hemp and other plant fibers more common among ordinary people provide durability and modest insulation. Each class adapted the same principle using what they could afford, showing how clothing bridged social differences even while displaying them. An amusing detail appears in some court writings, where nobles complained about the difficulty of moving gracefully while wearing many winter layers, comparing themselves to bundled scrolls. The image is oddly relatable. Even elegance must sometimes surrender to temperature. You notice that sleeves are long enough to cover hands when needed. People tuck their fingers inside, creating instant pockets of warmth. The collar is drawn snugly around the neck, protecting an area where heat escapes quickly. These are small gestures repeated constantly, forming a choreography of self-warming. Textile historians point out that the absence of stitched form-fitting garments allowed clothing to adapt to a wide range of conditions. A robe could serve as daywear blanket or extra padding at night. Versatility reduced the need for specialized items which would have required more resources to produce. There is also a subtle sensory comfort in the fabrics themselves. Silk slides softly against skin. Hemp has a faint earthy scent, especially when warmed by the body. The gentle rustle of layered cloth becomes part of the winter soundscape, replacing the silence left by sleeping insects and quiet fields. Some accounts describe people placing small packets of aromatic herbs inside their robes during winter. These sachets added fragrance while also discouraging insects that might seek shelter in the layers. Whether this practice was widespread or limited to certain regions is still discussed among researchers, but it suggests that warmth was intertwined with personal comfort and hygiene. You shift slightly, imagining how these garments would feel after hours beside the irori. They would absorb a trace of smoke, a reminder of the shared fire. Clothing carried the atmosphere of the home with it, almost like memory woven into fabric. The philosophy behind layering extends beyond practicality. Rather than creating a barrier between body and environment, these garments allow gradual adaptation. You are never completely insulated, never entirely exposed. The balance mirrors the architecture around you. In later centuries, as cotton became more widely available, padded winter garments would grow thicker and more specialized. But in this earlier period, ingenuity mattered more than bulk. People relied on structure overlap and careful wrapping instead of heavy stuffing. You begin to appreciate how putting on these layers was itself a daily ritual. Dressing in winter meant preparing for the season, consciously acknowledging the cold rather than ignoring it. Each fold secured against the chill was a small act of resilience. Scholars sometimes debate whether the aesthetic refinement of kimono layering evolved primarily from climate adaptation or from courtly fashion culture influencing everyday life. The truth likely lies somewhere in the overlap where necessity and beauty reinforced one another. As you sit there, sleeves drawn over your hands, you realize that warmth in ancient Japan was something you assembled each morning piece by piece until your own body became a carefully wrapped shelter against the winter air. As the evening deepens, your attention shifts from how the garments are worn to what they're made of. Not all fabrics hold warmth in the same way, and in ancient Japan the choice of fibre could determine how comfortably someone endured the season. Long before modern synthetic insulation, people relied entirely on natural materials, each with its own strengths and limitations. Silk, prized among the aristocracy, was more than a symbol of refinement. Its tightly woven fibres trapped pockets of air while remaining remarkably light. Contrary to the modern assumption that silk is only for summer, it functioned as an excellent thermal regulator. Court inventories from the Heian period list layered silk robes specifically designated for colder months, demonstrating that even elite fashion responded directly to climate. You imagine the feel of it now, smooth yet substantial warming quickly from body heat and holding that warmth close. Silk also dries faster than heavier fibres, which mattered in a country where winter could still carry dampness. Staying dry was as important as staying warm. For farmers, artisans and travellers, silk was often too expensive. Hemp cloth became the practical alternative. Hemp fibres are tougher and more porous, which means they do not insulate quite as well, but they are durable and resist decay. Many households compensated by wearing additional layers or combining hemp with other materials. Warmth came from accumulation rather than any single perfect fabric. A small but fascinating detail appears in some regional records describing garments lined with beaten tree bark fibres softened through repeated soaking and pounding. These textiles, while less refined, added another layer of insulation. It is a reminder that resourcefulness often mattered more than luxury. Cotton, which you might expect to dominate winter clothing, arrived relatively late as a widespread material. Although known earlier through trade, large-scale cultivation into Japan did not take hold until the medieval period and expanded further in the early modern era. Once available, cotton transformed winter life because it could be padded, quilted, and washed more easily than silk. This shift is well documented in economic histories that track the spread of cotton farming and its impact on everyday comfort. You picture how revolutionary that must have felt. A material that allowed thicker garments without enormous cost. Yet during the earlier centuries, you are visiting people still relied on clever layering rather than thick stuffing. There is also evidence that some winter robes were lightly padded with raw silk floss or plant fibres to increase insulation. These were early ancestors of quilted clothing. The padding was modest, just enough to trap more air, not to create the bulky shapes seen in later centuries. Textile scholars continue to examine how regional climates influenced fabric choice. Northern provinces with harsher winters experimented more with padding and heavier weaves, while milder areas relied on layering alone. The variation shows that there was no single solution across the archipelago, only a shared philosophy of adaptation. As you sit near the hearth, you notice how these fabrics respond differently to warmth. Silk reflects the firelight with a gentle sheen. Hemp remains matte and grounded. Each material carries its own sensory presence, contributing to the quiet richness of the room. An unusual anecdote survives in folklore about travellers stuffing dried grasses between layers of clothing during especially cold journeys. Whether this was a desperate improvisation or a commonly accepted trick is uncertain, but it illustrates how people used whatever insulating material they could find when away from home. The process of making these textiles was itself tied to the seasons. Spinning, weaving and dyeing often took place months before winter arrived, meaning warmth had to be prepared long in advance. Clothing was not simply purchased, it was anticipated, planned and crafted through communal labour. You begin to sense how deeply connected warmth was to agriculture, trade and craftsmanship. A winter robe represented fields, cultivated fibres, processed threads spun and hands that worked patiently through earlier seasons. Even the colours played a role. Darker dyes absorbed more sunlight during the day, providing a subtle additional warmth when outdoors. While aesthetic preference certainly influenced colour choices, practical benefit may also have guided them, though historians still discuss how intentional this effect was. You adjust your imagined layers, again feeling how each fabric contributes something slightly different. No single one solves the problem of winter. Together they create a flexible shield that moves, breathes and adapts. And as the charcoal continues its slow glow, you realise that staying warm here depended as much on the quiet technology of fibres and thread as it did on fire itself. Eventually you imagined stepping beyond the comfort of the house, because life in ancient Japan did not pause simply because winter had arrived. Roads still needed to be travelled, fields checked, messages delivered. The cold followed people wherever they went, and so they carried their solutions with them. Before leaving, you are handed something that looks at first like a bundle of straw shaped into a cloak. This is a mino, a rain cape woven from rice straw, and while it is often associated with wet weather, it also serves as protection against snow and wind. When worn, it forms a thick outer shell that traps air while shedding moisture. Paintings from medieval scrolls frequently depict travellers wrapped in these shaggy garments, instantly recognisable silhouettes against pale winter landscapes. You slip it over your shoulders in your mind. It is lighter than expected, though slightly scratchy with the dry scent of harvested fields. The straw rustles softly as you move, creating its own quiet rhythm with each step. Unlike cloth, which can become damp and heavy, the mino allows snow to fall away before it melts, preserving the warmth of the layers beneath. Alongside it, you would wear a wide straw hat called a kasa, angled to shield your face from wind. Together, these simple items transform agricultural byproducts into winter gear. Rice, the foundation of sustenance, also provided protection after harvest, linking survival in every sense to the same crop. Historical travel diaries confirm that such garments were standard equipment for commoners journeying between villages, especially along routes like the Tokaido. These accounts describe long walks through frost-covered landscapes, the straw cloaks forming moving patches of golden brown against white snow. There is something quietly resourceful in this reuse of materials. After feeding the population, the leftover stalks continued to serve. Nothing was wasted if it could still provide value. One curious legend tells of itinerant monks who became so associated with their straw cloaks that villagers could identify them from a distance purely by silhouette, long before faces were visible. While romanticised, it highlights how universal this winter attire became. You imagine walking a narrow path, now your sandals crunching over frozen ground. The mino shifts with each movement, allowing air to circulate without stripping away heat. It is not perfectly warm, but it is enough. In a culture accustomed to moderation, enough is often all that is required. Scholars examining surviving examples of these cloaks still discuss how tightly they were woven, and whether regional variations affected their insulating ability. Some versions were dense and almost thatch-like, while others were looser, prioritizing lightness over protection. The diversity reflects local climate and craftsmanship rather than a single standardized design. Travelers also relied on gaiters or wrappings around the lower legs, often made from cloth or additional straw to prevent snow from entering their sandals. These coverings added another layer of insulation while keeping movement flexible. You notice that mobility always remains a priority. Unlike heavy winter coats that restrict motion, these garments allow bending, walking, and working without difficulty. Warmth must not interfere with daily responsibilities. There is also an auditory dimension to these journeys. The soft brushing sound of straw accompanies each step, mingling with the distant call of crows or the muffled rush of a winter stream. Even outdoors, the sensory world feels subdued, as if the season itself encourages quieter movement. Some regional records suggest that travellers occasionally warmed themselves by stopping at roadside fires maintained by local communities or inns. Whether these were consistently available or depended on goodwill is still a matter historians investigate, but they hint at networks of shared care along important routes. You continue along this imagined road, realising that winter here was not something escaped by staying indoors. It was navigated, literally walked through, with tools made from the same land that produced food and shelter. And as you move through the pale light of a cold afternoon wrapped in straw and layered cloth, you understand that even far from the hearth, people carried with them a portable version of home's quiet warmth. When you return from the imagined road and slide once more into the house, you begin to notice the walls again, if that word even applies. The boundaries around you are made of shoji, those delicate wooden lattices covered with translucent paper. At first, it seems impossible that something so thin could stand between you and winter. You can see the faint outline of branches outside, shadows moving as the wind stirs. Light passes through easily. Surely you think cold must do the same, and in a sense it does. Shoji are not meant to seal out the environment completely, instead they diffuse it. The paper softens incoming air currents and spreads light evenly across the room. This creates a gentle buffer rather than a hard barrier. Architectural historians often point out that shoji function more like filters than walls, moderating rather than blocking seasonal change. You sit close to one panel and feel only the faintest trace of chill. The combination of layered paper wooden framework and the still air inside the room reduces sudden drafts. It is a subtle effect, but over time it matters. Winter here is endured through accumulation of small advantages. The paper itself, traditionally made from mulberry fibres, is stronger than it appears. It allows a bit of humidity to pass through, preventing condensation that could lead to dampness and mould. In a climate where moisture can be as uncomfortable as cold, this breathability is essential. The house remains dry, and dry air feels warmer against the skin. There is also an aesthetic calm to these pale surfaces. The soft glow they create during daylight reduces the need for additional fuel-conserving charcoal for the evening. Even the management of light becomes part of thermal strategy. An unusual note found in some household manuals mentions that damaged shoji paper was sometimes patched quickly during winter using scraps of cloth or additional layers, prioritizing function over appearance until warmer months allowed proper repair. These temporary fixes might have looked uneven, but they helped maintain that fragile buffer against the cold. At night, heavier wooden shutters called amado could be drawn across the exterior. These added protection from wind and helped secure the house. Closing them transformed the atmosphere, muting outside sounds and creating a deeper sense of enclosure. The temperature might not rise dramatically, but the reduction of moving air made the space feel noticeably more stable. You listen as one of these shutters slides into place with a low wooden thud. The room grows quieter. Even psychologically, the act signals that the household is settling in, conserving warmth and energy until morning. Some researchers have proposed that this layered approach to enclosure influenced later architectural ideas about modular space in Japan. Others caution against drawing too straight a line between early domestic practice and modern design philosophy. The connection remains an open discussion, but the continuity of flexible space is striking. You run your hand lightly along the paper surface. It is cool but not icy, textured faintly by the fibres within. The fragility encourages mindfulness. People move carefully to avoid tearing it, reinforcing a slower pace of life during winter months when haste offers little advantage. There is also a visual benefit. Because shoji scatter light, even a small flame or a lamp can illuminate a wide area. This efficiency reduces the need for multiple fires, lowering both fuel consumption and risk. In a city where accidental blazes were a constant threat, such restraint carried real importance. You imagine snowfall outside flakes collecting stuntly against the outer shutters, while inside the paper screens glow faintly from firelight. The contrast is gentle rather than dramatic. Winter is present but softened, translated into shadow and hush. A charming bit of folklore claims that children sometimes press their hands against the cold paper to trace shapes or watch their breath fog the surface, turning the boundary into a canvas of fleeting patterns. Whether universally practiced or not, it captures how even thin walls became part of lived experience rather than mere structure. You lean back again toward the eatery, understanding now that warmth in this environment does not rely on thick stone or sealed glass. It comes from layers of clothing, of fuel, of behaviour, and even of walls that are less barriers than participants in the seasonal dance. And as the filtered light fades into evening, the shoji around you continue their quiet work, holding just enough of the world at bay to let warmth gather where it is needed most. As the night grows colder, you're invited to shift closer to another ingenious source of comfort, something that at first looks like an ordinary low table. A quilt is draped over it, spilling onto the tatami like a soft pool of fabric. Beneath the table, hidden from view, rests a small heat source. This is an early form of the kotatsu, or more precisely its ancestor, a clever arrangement that concentrates warmth exactly where people need it. You slide your legs under the table and feel the difference instantly. Heat gathers around your knees and feet, rising slowly through the enclosed space created by the quilt. Instead of trying to warm an entire room, this device warms the human body directly. It is a remarkably efficient solution, especially in a house designed to remain airy. The earliest versions were often built over a sunken hearth or used a portable brazier placed beneath a wooden frame. By the Muromachi period, this style of localized heating had become common enough to appear in illustrated scrolls, showing families seated together with their lower bodies tucked beneath layered cloth. The principle is simple. trap heat in a small volume, share it collectively. You settle further into the warmth, noticing how the heavy fabric prevents heat from escaping while still allowing enough air circulation to remain safe. The quilt itself is thick, sometimes padded, adding another insulating barrier. Hands rest comfortably on the tabletop while the rest of the body enjoys a pocket of rising warmth. A small but amusing observation recorded by later writers notes that once people were comfortably seated in such arrangements, they became reluctant to leave even for chores. The temptation to remain inside this warm enclosure was strong enough to inspire jokes about winter laziness centuries ago. You can understand why. Compared to the open coolness of the room, this feels luxurious, yet it requires very little fuel. A modest amount of charcoal sustains the heat for hours. Efficiency again triumphs over intensity. The kotatsu also shapes social interaction. Because only a few people can share it at once, gatherings become intimate. Conversation naturally settles into a slower rhythm. Tea is passed, small dishes are arranged, and time stretches. Warmth encourages stillness, and stillness conserves warmth. Some historians suggest that this form of shared heating reinforced patterns of communal living, where family members clustered physically during winter evenings. Others argue that such closeness was already typical, and the kotatsu simply fit existing habits. The direction of influence remains a topic of scholarly discussion. You listen to the faint crackle from the brazier beneath, softer than the irori but steady. The heat is focused, almost personal, reaching you in a way that feels intentional rather than ambient. It reminds you that ancient Japanese solutions often worked by narrowing their goals. Instead of conquering the environment, they shaped small zones of comfort. There is also portability to consider. Some versions could be disassembled or moved, allowing warmth to follow daily activities. In homes where space changed frequently, this flexibility mattered. A heating device that could adapt to shifting rooms matched the overall philosophy of the house itself. Textile historians point out that the quilts used with these tables became important household items in their own right. Layers of fabric, sometimes stuffed with cotton, in later centuries added both insulation and softness. Even before cotton became widespread, multiple cloth layers created a similar effect. You stretch your toes slightly and feel how the heat pulls at the lowest point, reminding you that warmth naturally rises. Sitting low to the ground takes advantage of this physical truth. Furniture design, posture, and heating method all align with gravity rather than resisting it. An interesting regional story tells of travellers recognizing welcoming homes in winter by spotting families gathered under these quilted tables through partially opened shutters. The sight of shared warmth signaled hospitality even before a word was spoken. Researchers continue examining how early these devices became common across different classes, since surviving examples are rare and written references uneven. Yet the concept clearly spread because it answered a universal need with elegant simplicity. You rest your hands on the tabletop, feeling warmth seep upward, and realize that this small sheltered space is like a miniature climate created just for those who sit within it. In a season defined by restraint and resourcefulness, the kotatsu becomes less a piece of furniture and more a quiet agreement to share warmth, conserve fuel, and linger together a little longer while winter waits outside. Later, when it is time to sleep, you might expect the search for warmth to become more difficult. Night deepens the cold, and without constant movement, the body loses heat quickly. Yet the preparations for rest reveal another carefully considered system. Bedding in ancient Japan is not elevated on frames or surrounded by thick mattress. Instead, it is arranged directly on the tatami floor in the form of layered futon. You watch as quilts and padded mats are unfolded from storage, each placed deliberately. During the day, these items are kept in cupboards to prevent dampness and to keep living spaces open. At night, they transform the room into a sleeping area. This daily cycle of laying out and putting away bedding also helps maintain dryness, an essential factor in staying warm. Tatami itself contributes to insulation. The tightly packed straw core holds air within its structure, reducing the cold that would otherwise rise from the ground. While not heated, it provides a gentler surface temperature than bare earth or wood. Lying close to it allows your body to share heat with the immediate environment rather than losing warmth to open space. You settle down beneath layers of quilted fabric. The futon molds around you, creating a cocoon that traps body heat efficiently. Instead of warming the entire room, you warm the small space enclosed by your bedding. This approach mirrors the philosophy seen throughout the house. Focus on the person, not the building. Historical documents from later centuries describe families owning multiple futon layers specifically for winter, use some filled with cotton, once that material became widely available. Earlier versions relied on stacked textiles and occasionally silk floss padding. The idea remained the same regardless of filling. More layers meant more trapped air, and more trapped air meant greater warmth. There is a quiet comfort in how these materials smell. Clean straw, sun-dried cloth, and faint traces of smoke create a scent associated with rest and safety. Even sensory memory plays a role in the experience of warmth. You notice that sleeping together was common, especially among families. Shared body heat added another layer of insulation, an entirely natural method requiring no additional fuel. While modern privacy standards differ, this arrangement made practical sense during cold months. An intriguing detail recorded in some rural accounts mentions the use of heated stones wrapped in cloth and placed near the feet before bedtime. These makeshift warmers gradually released heat through the night. Whether this was widespread or limited to certain communities remains uncertain, but it demonstrates once again the creativity applied to small-scale solutions. The room itself is allowed to grow colder than you might expect. There is no attempt to maintain daytime warmth. Instead, the household relies on bedding to provide the necessary insulation until morning. This reduces fuel consumption dramatically, preserving charcoal for cooking and essential heating. Sleep patterns may also have adapted to these conditions. Some historians suggest that people retired earlier during winter simply because darkness and cold made extended activity impractical. Others caution that written evidence is too limited to draw firm conclusions. Still, the rhythm of shorter days likely influenced daily schedules. You pull the covers closer in your imagination, noticing how quickly your own warmth builds inside this layered space. The cool air above remains untouched, yet inside the futon there is comfort. It is a reminder that warmth is often most effective when concentrated. Outside the night is still. Frost forms silently on rooftops and fields. Inside, breathing slows, fabric holds heat, and the house rests along with its occupants. Even the act of storing bedding each morning contributes to winter survival. Futon are aired out, sometimes hung in weak sunlight to remove moisture. Dry materials insulate far better than damp ones, so this routine maintains their effectiveness throughout the season. You begin to see how sleeping arrangements are not separate from the broader system of winter living. They are an extension of the same principles found in clothing architecture and hearth design. Everything works by layering, sharing, and conserving. And as you drift into this imagined rest wrapped securely against the cold, you understand that even in sleep, ancient households practiced the art of staying warm through attention to the smallest details. When morning comes, the cold has not disappeared. It lingers in the corners of the room in the faint chill of the air you first breathe as you sit up from the futon. Yet the day begins not with rushing to rekindle heat, but with a ritual that might surprise you. Bathing in winter, intentionally. You follow the household routine toward a bathing area where steam already drifts upward in soft clouds. Water has been heated often using the same charcoal that warmed the evening hearth. Immersing the body in hot water raises core temperature quickly, a deeply effective method of combating cold that requires far less fuel than attempting to warm entire living spaces for hours. Communal bathing practices in Japan date back many centuries, influenced in part by Buddhist ideas about purification and health. By the Heian period, aristocratic residences included bath facilities, while in rural settings, simpler wooden tubs served the same purpose. The historical record shows that bathing was valued not only for cleanliness, but also for restoring circulation and comfort during colder seasons. You lower yourself into the imagined water and feel the transformation almost immediately. Heat surrounds you, evenly reaching muscles and skin in a way that air never could. Unlike the directional warmth of the hearth, this is complete immersion. The contrast with the chilly dressing room beyond makes the sensation even more profound. After emerging, people dressed quickly, layering garments to trap the newly gained warmth. The bath functioned almost like charging a battery, giving the body stored heat to carry through the morning. Some accounts suggest that in certain communities families bathed sequentially, using the same heated water to conserve fuel, carefully maintaining temperature by adding small amounts of hot water as needed. This practice reflects both practicality and a cultural emphasis on shared resources. An interesting anecdote appears in later writings, describing travellers seeking out inns partly for the promise of a hot bath, considering it one of the greatest comforts during winter journeys. The appeal was universal enough to shape early hospitality traditions. Scholars continue to explore how much of bathing culture derived from religious influence versus simple environmental adaptation. The two likely reinforced one another, making the habit both spiritually meaningful and physically beneficial. You notice how the warmth from the bath lingers even after dressing. Fingers remain flexible, shoulders relax, the body feels prepared to face the unheated spaces of the house. Instead of trying to eliminate cold entirely, people strengthen themselves against it. There is also an emotional dimension. Steam-rising water sounding softly against wood, and the quiet pause in daily labour create a sense of renewal that counters the austerity of winter mornings. Heating water required effort, of course. Fires had to be managed carefully and fuel could not be wasted. Yet because bathing warmed people so efficiently, it was often more economical than prolonged room heating. You imagine the smell of the bath area, clean wood mineral notes from heated water and faint smoke drifting from the firebox below. These sensory cues became associated with relief from cold, reinforcing the routine psychologically as well as physically. In some regions, aromatic herbs were occasionally added to bathwater, believed to promote circulation or prevent illness. Whether these additions had measurable effects is still debated, but they demonstrate an early attempt to combine comfort and health. After bathing, daily activities resumed. Cooking, repairing tools, tending animals, or preparing materials all continued in spaces that remained cool. Yet the body now carried warmth from within, reducing reliance on constant external heat. You realize that this practice reflects a broader philosophy repeated throughout winter life. Instead of forcing the environment to change, people changed their interaction with it. They created moments of intense warmth that sustained them through longer stretches of chill. And as steam fades into the morning air, you see how even something as simple as bathing became an essential strategy in enduring the season with resilience and quiet grace. After the bath and the careful layering of clothes, attention turns to something equally important: food. In winter, meals are not only about nourishment, but also about generating warmth from within. The kitchen area near the irori becomes active again, and you begin to notice how cooking methods are chosen as much for their thermal benefits as for flavour. A pot is set over the coals and ingredients are added slowly. Rice, always central to the diet, is served hot, releasing steam that carries a soft, comforting scent. Alongside it comes soups and simmered dishes known today as nabe-style cooking, though earlier forms existed long before the modern term. These meals remain warm for extended periods because they are kept over gentle heat, allowing people to eat gradually without losing temperature. Historical sources describe how such one-pot preparations became especially valued during colder months, since they required less fuel than cooking multiple separate dishes. A single fire could sustain both warmth and sustenance. Efficiency shaped cuisine just as it shaped architecture. You lean closer and feel the rising steam touch your face. Eating something hot changes your perception of the room almost instantly. The body responds by increasing circulation, creating a glow that spreads outward from the centre. Root vegetables such as daikon radish, burdock, root and carrots appear frequently in these meals because they store well through winter and absorb heat beautifully when simmered. Their cultivation and preservation were crucial to seasonal survival, a fact supported by agricultural records that detail storage methods designed to last until spring. An intriguing culinary custom mentioned in some regional accounts involves adding a small amount of fermented paste or pickled ingredients to winter dishes believed to strengthen the body against cold. While modern nutritionists might explain this in terms of probiotics or salt content, people at the time simply recognized that these foods made them feel more resilient. Tea accompanies the meal, served hot and replenished often. The act of holding a warm bowl between your hands becomes another subtle source of comfort. The warmth is not dramatic, but it is constant, reinforcing the layered approach seen everywhere else. Some historians suggest that the emphasis on warm liquid-rich foods contributed to the communal nature of dining in winter, as people gathered around shared pots rather than eating individually plated meals. Others argue that this style of eating reflected broader cultural preferences unrelated to climate. The exact motivation remains a subject of interpretation. You notice how slowly the meal progresses. There is no rush. Keeping the pot over the fire allows conversation to continue while food stays hot. Time itself seems to stretch, aligning with the deliberate pace required to manage fuel and maintain comfort. A small but charming detail recorded in old household notes mentions that children were sometimes given the task of gently stirring the pot to keep ingredients from settling, an easy chore that also kept them close to the warmth of the hearth. Even the choice of seasonings reflects winter sensibility. Strong flavours like miso or soy-based broths create a sense of depth and satisfaction, making modest ingredients feel substantial. Psychological warmth matters as much as physical heat. You take another imagined sip of soup and feel how it spreads through you, countering the cool air that still lingers beyond the hearth's reach. Unlike quick bursts of heat, food provides sustained internal energy, allowing people to move back into less heated spaces without discomfort. Preservation techniques also played a role. Drying fish, fermenting vegetables, and storing grains ensured that cooking could continue even when fresh supplies were scarce. These methods required planning months in advance, linking winter meals to the labour of earlier seasons. Researchers continue to study how regional variations in diet affected winter endurance, since coastal communities relied more heavily on seafood, while inland areas depended on preserved plants and grains. Each adapted to local resources, while following the same underlying principle of warming the body from within. As the pot simmers quietly and bowls are refilled, you understand that winter cuisine was never accidental. It was designed, refined, and repeated year after year as part of the broader system that allowed people to live comfortably without ever truly heating the entire house. And in the steady rhythm of cooking, eating, and sharing warmth, another layer of winter survival reveals itself. After the meal is quieted and the pot has been set aside, another kind of warmth begins to take precedence. Someone prepares tea again, not hurriedly but with deliberate care. The act feels less like simple refreshment and more like a continuation of the evening's slow gathering of comfort. You watch as water is heated, poured, and allowed to steep. The fragrance rises gently earthy and slightly sweet. Holding the bowl between your hands becomes as important as drinking from it. The ceramic absorbs heat from the liquid and releases it slowly into your palms, turning the vessel itself into a small heater. Tea had already become an established part of Japanese culture by the late Heian and Kamakura periods, influenced by earlier practices brought from China. Historical records note its use among monks to maintain alertness during meditation, but it also found a place in everyday domestic life, especially during colder seasons when warm drinks were both restorative and practical. You take a sip. The warmth spreads gradually, encouraging slow breathing and stillness. Unlike food which satisfies hunger, tea seems to address the mind. It creates a pause between activities, a moment where the cold outside feels distant without ever being forgotten. There is a sensory quiet that accompanies this ritual. Steam curls upward. The faint sound of liquid touching the bowl echoes softly in the room. Even conversation lowers, as if matching the subdued atmosphere. Some early anecdotes describe people warming their hands over empty bowls before refilling them, savouring every trace of heat. It is a small gesture, but one repeated countless times through winter evenings. Scholars have long discussed whether the later formalisation of tea ceremony aesthetics grew partly from these practical winter habits. The emphasis on simplicity, warmth, and shared space may have roots in the everyday need to create comfort with minimal resources. Others caution that ceremonial traditions developed for more complex philosophical reasons. The connection remains an open and fascinating question. You notice how tea extends the usefulness of the hearth without requiring additional fuel. The same charcoal that cooked dinner now heats water again, extracting yet another purpose from a single fire. Efficiency is never separated from hospitality. The bowls themselves are often thick and slightly rough, designed to retain heat. When cradled close, they warm not just hands, but sleeves and wrists. Physical contact with warmth, even in such a small form, changes how the entire room feels. In some regions, roasted grains were brewed as alternatives when tea leaves were scarce, producing a nutty drink that served the same warming role. Whether made from barley or other local crops, these beverages reveal how adaptable the custom could be. You shift closest to the irori again, tea in hand, feeling how internal and external warmth reinforce one another. The body becomes less sensitive to drafts. The chill remains, but it no longer dominates your awareness. There is also a social dimension. Sharing tea keeps people gathered, reducing the need to move into colder parts of the house. Staying together conserves warmth collectively, another subtle strategy repeated without conscious thought. Some historians suggest that winter encouraged longer indoor conversations, storytelling, or poetry recitation, precisely because the hearth and tea created a comfortable environment for such activities. Others note that literary culture flourished year-round, making it difficult to assign seasonal cause. Still, the image of quiet winter evenings filled with words persists strongly in surviving writings. A small detail recorded in one diary mentions listeners warming inkstones near the fire, so brushes would flow properly during poetry composition. Even creativity needed thermal assistance. You finish the last sip and feel the lingering heat settle into your chest. Outside, the air remains sharp, the season unchanged. Yet inside, through repeated acts of boiling, pouring and sharing, people build a psychological shelter as real as any wall. And in that steady rhythm of tea and conversation, winter becomes not just something endured, but something gently inhabited. With fire always present in some form, you begin to realize that warmth carried a constant shadow of danger. In settlements where nearly every structure was made of wood, paper and straw, a single mistake could transform comfort into catastrophe. Winter demanded fire, yet it also demanded vigilance. You notice how carefully the hearth is maintained. Ashes are arranged neatly to contain embers. Tools are placed within reach, so adjustments can be made without scattering sparks. There is no casual tossing of fuel. Every movement is controlled, almost ritualized. Urban records from pre-modern Japan frequently mention fires as one of the greatest threats to cities such as Kyoto and later Edo. Dense neighborhoods and flammable materials made conflagrations difficult to stop once they began. This historical reality shaped both architecture and behavior, encouraging modest heating methods rather than large open flames. Even the irori central, as it was, remained relatively small compared to fireplaces in many other parts of the world. Limiting the size of the fire reduced risk while still providing sufficient warmth for those gathered nearby. You imagine how winter winds might fan a stray spark, making households acutely aware of their responsibility to monitor heat sources at all times. Someone is always nearby. Fires are never left unattended. A curious practice mentioned in some documents describes keeping buckets of water or sand within reach during the night, ready in case embers shifted unexpectedly. While simple, this precaution reveals how deeply fire safety was woven into daily routines. The design of the house also reflects this awareness. Open interiors allowed smoke to disperse rather than accumulate, reducing the chance of suffocation or hidden flare-ups. Materials were chosen not only for availability, but also for how they behaved near controlled heat. Scholars still debate how much these fire-conscious habits influence broader urban planning decisions. Some argue that repeated disasters led to stricter spatial organisation, while others believe changes occurred gradually without centralised enforcement. The evidence varies by the region and era. You hear the faint scraping sound of someone smoothing ash again, ensuring embers remain stable for the evening. Even this quiet act carries a sense of responsibility. Warmth must be sustained but never trusted completely. Lighting followed similar caution. Oil lamps and candles were used sparingly and often placed within protective holders. Allowing light to spread through shoji screens reduced the need for multiple flames, another way architecture and safety intertwined. There is also a cultural layer to this attentiveness. Living with ever-present risk fostered an appreciation for moderation. Fires were tools, not spectacles. Their value lay in steadiness rather than intensity. An anecdote from a provincial chronicle tells of a family praised by neighbours for never once causing a winter fire incident, a reputation considered worthy of admiration. The idea that careful heating could define a household's character may sound unusual today, yet in that environment it made perfect sense. You shift slightly, noticing how the hearth's glow is partially shielded by its recessed design. The floor-level placement naturally blocks sparks from travelling far, a small architectural decision with significant safety benefits. Researchers examining surviving homes often point out these subtle protective features, though interpretations differ on whether they were intentional innovations or gradual refinements learned through experience. Outside, the night remains cold and still. Inside, warmth persists, but always with an undercurrent of watchfulness. Comfort and caution exist side by side, inseparable. You begin to understand that staying warm in ancient Japan required not only clever techniques but also discipline. Heat was never something to indulge in carelessly. It was managed, respected, and kept within bounds so that it could serve without destroying, and in that balance between necessity and restraint, winter households found a way to live safely with the very element that sustained them. If you were to travel northward, from the relatively sheltered basin of Kyoto, into regions where winter grew harsher, you would notice subtle but important differences in how people built their homes and organised daily life. Mountain villages and areas closer to the Sea of Japan received heavier snowfall, sometimes enough to reshape entire landscapes for months at a time. Here, farmhouses often featured steeper roofs designed to prevent snow from accumulating to dangerous levels. The angle allowed weight to slide away rather than press down on wooden beams. Surviving examples of these architectural forms, particularly in what later became known as snow country, demonstrate how builders adapted to local climate without abandoning the overall philosophy of flexible construction. You imagine standing outside such a house while snow falls, steadily muffling sound until the world feels wrapped in wool. The roof sheds thick layers in slow cascades, each soft thud absorbed by the ground. Even maintenance became seasonal labour, with residents clearing pathways and reinforcing structures as needed. Inside, the same principles you have already seen continue, but sometimes with added emphasis. Hearths might be used more frequently. Storage areas were stocked carefully before winter's onset because travel could become difficult. Preparation in autumn determined comfort months later. Agricultural records from northern provinces show detailed planning for fuel gathering, with families cutting and drying wood well in advance to supplement charcoal supplies. Reliable heating depended on anticipating isolation. A curious regional adaptation described in some ethnographic accounts involved hanging extra straw bundles along interior walls during peak cold periods. These acted as temporary insulation, removable once temperatures rose again. Whether this was common practice or limited to particular villages remains uncertain, but it highlights the creative use of available materials. You can almost feel the difference as you sit near a hearth in one of these rural homes. The fire may burn slightly longer. The stored provisions stack neatly nearby, evidence of a lifestyle attuned to endurance rather than convenience. Scholars examining these communities often discuss how geography shaped variations in winter experience. Some argue that environmental pressures encourage stronger communal cooperation, while others find similar social patterns across regions regardless of snowfall. The relationship between climate and culture continues to invite interpretation. Daily routines also adjusted to shorter daylight hours and harsher weather. Outdoor work was compressed into limited windows of time, while indoor activities such as tool repair, weaving, or food preparation occupied the long evenings. You notice how sound behaves differently in such conditions. Snow absorbs echoes, making even simple actions feel quieter. The crackle of fire seems louder by contrast, reinforcing the sense that warmth is a fragile centre surrounded by vast stillness. An old folk tale from snowy regions tells of travellers navigating by the faint glow of farmhouse hearths, visible through storms, using those points of light as guides across otherwise featureless terrain. Whether embellished or not, it captures how essential these warm spaces were to survival. The architecture, though still light and adaptable, occasionally incorporated thicker thatching or additional interior partitions to create more contained areas during extreme weather. These changes remained modest, never transforming houses into sealed structures, but they offered incremental protection. Researchers studying surviving examples debate how much these features evolved organically versus being shared through regional knowledge networks. Builders likely learned from one another, adapting successful methods to their own environments. As you imagine spending a winter here, you sense a rhythm shaped by patience. Snow falls is cleared and falls again, fires are tended, supplies, measured, clothing repaired. Nothing is rushed because winter itself cannot be hurried. And in these quieter, snow-laden regions, the same philosophy you have encountered all along continues to guide life. Warmth is not forced into existence through grand means. It is prepared, preserved and shared, allowing communities to endure even the deepest cold with steady resilience. Even in the depth of winter, daily work does not disappear. You might imagine people retreating entirely indoors waiting for spring, but life in ancient Japan rarely allowed such pauses. Instead, routines shifted to accommodate the cold, reshaping how and when tasks were done rather than eliminating them. Morning activities often began later, allowing the weakest chill to ease after sunrise. Without artificial lighting to extend productivity easily, people align their schedules closely with daylight. This seasonal adjustment is noted in historical agricultural calendars that advise communities on timing winter labour to conserve both energy and fuel. You picture stepping outside, briefly wrapped in layers and straw cloak to tend animals or gather the supplies. The air is raw, but movement generates its own warmth. Physical activity was an important part of staying comfortable. Rather than trying to remain perfectly warm at rest, people alternated between motion and stillness throughout the day. Tools were sometimes adapted as well. Handles might be wrapped in cloth to prevent hands from numbing against cold surfaces. Tasks requiring fine dexterity were brought closer to the hearth whenever possible. Workspaces migrated towards warmth just as people did. An interesting observation appears in a few surviving household notes describing winter as a preferred time for mending, weaving, and crafting precisely because families were already gathered indoors. Cold weather encouraged maintenance work that might otherwise be postponed during busier agricultural seasons. You sit near the irori again and imagine someone repairing a basket or sewing garments while leaning into the heat. Productivity and comfort merge, each supporting the other. Scholars examining seasonal labour patterns continue to debate whether winter reduced overall workload significantly or merely transformed it. Some evidence suggests a slower pace, while other records show steady domestic production. The truth likely varied depending on region and occupation. There is also an emotional dimension to this rhythm. Winter tasks tend to be repetitive and methodical, encouraging focus rather than haste. The quiet sounds of tools thread or straw being handled blend with the low crackle of charcoal, forming a steady auditory backdrop. In certain communities, shared work gatherings developed where neighbours met in one home to complete tasks collectively while benefiting from a single fire. This arrangement conserved fuel and strengthened social bonds. Whether these gatherings were formalised traditions or informal cooperation remains unclear, but they appear frequently in later descriptions of rural life. You imagine the comfort of such shared effort. Hands busy, bodies warm, conversation flowing slowly. Cold becomes less oppressive when divided among many people. Even outdoor labour continued when necessary. Firewood still had to be collected, paths cleared and repairs made. People relied on layered clothing and deliberate pacing, avoiding sweat that could later chill the body. Managing exertion was part of thermal strategy. Historians studying material culture often point out that winter tools show signs of careful maintenance, suggesting they were relied upon consistently rather than stored away. Survival required engagement with the environment, not withdrawal from it. A small but telling anecdote recounts farmers warming their hands over portable braziers before returning briefly to outside work, repeating the cycle throughout the day. These short returns to heat acted like resets, allowing labour to continue without exhaustion. As afternoon light fades earlier than in other seasons, tasks wind down naturally. There is little attempt to extend activity artificially. Conserving fuel takes precedence over prolonging productivity. You begin to understand that winter shaped not only how people stayed warm, but how they measured time and effort. The season encouraged moderation, pacing, and attentiveness to the body's limits. And in this steady alternation between work and warmth, ancient households found a sustainable rhythm that allowed life to continue even when the landscape itself seemed to pause under frost. As you continue observing the household through the long winter day, you begin to notice how warmth is quietly distributed according to age and need. The closest places to the hearth are not random. They are often occupied by elders, small children, or honoured guests. Practicality and social structure blend together in ways that feel natural rather than enforced. In societies without abundant fuel, heat becomes a shared resource that must be allocated thoughtfully. Historical descriptions of domestic interiors frequently mention seating hierarchies around the irori, suggesting that placement carried both symbolic respect and real physical benefit. The warmest position was a form of care. You imagine a grandparent seated nearest the glowing coals, hands extended comfortably, while younger adults move in and out of the circle as they manage tasks. Children drift close, then wander away, then return again, drawn instinctively to the heat. This arrangement may have strengthened intergenerational bonds during winter months. Some scholars argue that seasonal clustering reinforced family cohesion, while others caution that written evidence rarely describes emotions, directly leaving interpretation open. Even so, the physical closeness is undeniable. Blankets or extra garments might be placed over those most vulnerable to cold. Unlike modern individualized heating, warmth here is layered, collectively adjusted by observation and empathy rather than technology. A charming anecdote from a later rural account describes children competing for spots nearest the fire, only to be gently redirected by adults who reminded them to let elders sit there first. The story, whether literal or moralizing, reflects values shaped partly by environmental necessity. You watch how people shift subtly throughout the evening, rotating positions so no one grows too cold. This constant adjustment becomes almost unconscious, a choreography learned over years of shared winters. The architecture itself encourages such gathering. With few separate heated rooms, families naturally converge in one place. Rather than dispersing into private spaces, they remain within a shared thermal zone. Warmth, conversation, and presence become inseparable. Researchers examining household archaeology sometimes point to the central wear patterns around hearths as evidence of sustained group activity in these areas. Yet interpretations differ on whether these patterns reflect social customs or simple functional necessity. You notice that even animals, when kept indoors or nearby, might benefit from residual warmth. Their presence added both companionship and a small contribution of body heat, another quiet layer in the system of mutual survival. There is also a teaching aspect embedded in this arrangement. Younger members of the household learned by watching how fires were tended, how clothing was layered, and how fuel was conserved. Winter functioned as a season of instruction as much as endurance. In some regions, stories or songs were shared during these gatherings, passing time while reinforcing cultural memory. Whether meant for entertainment or education, they filled the darker hours when outdoor activity was limited. You feel the atmosphere now as one of collective shelter rather than isolated comfort. The cold outside emphasizes the warmth created inside, not just physically but socially. Each person's presence contributes to the environment's stability. Historians sometimes discuss whether such winter clustering influenced broader Japanese values, emphasizing harmony and group awareness. The idea is compelling, though difficult to prove definitively. Climate alone cannot explain cultural philosophy, yet it surely played a role in shaping daily interactions. As the fire settles into a steady glow and voices soften into evening quiet, you realize that warmth in ancient Japan was rarely an individual possession. It was something shared, adjusted, and protected together, passed gently from one generation to the next with every winter that came and went. If you leave this household for a time and walk toward a nearby temple complex, you find that religious spaces face the same winter challenges, though their responses carried a slightly different tone. Buddhist monasteries and temples were often larger, more open structures built to accommodate gatherings, rituals, and meditation. These airy halls could become especially cold once temperatures dropped. Yet monks did not attempt to transform these buildings into tightly heated environments. Instead, they relied on many of the same localized strategies used in homes. Braziers filled with charcoal were placed strategically, offering small centres of warmth without endangering the larger wooden structures. These portable heaters could be moved as needed following daily routines. Historical temple records describe strict attention to fuel usage since monasteries depended on donations and careful resource management. Fires were modest, controlled, and never excessive. The goal was to maintain functionality rather than comfort in the modern sense. You imagine sitting in a meditation hall during winter. The air is cool, almost bracing, but a nearby brazier provides just enough heat to keep hands flexible. Layers of robes serve as insulation, and the act of sitting still encourages awareness of breath and body temperature. Some historians suggest that enduring seasonal cold may have reinforced ascetic ideals within certain Buddhist communities, making physical discomfort part of spiritual discipline. Others argue that monks simply adapted practical household methods without attaching deeper meaning. The relationship between climate and religious experience remains an open question. An intriguing detail preserved in temple anecdotes mentions monks warming ink stones before copying sutras, ensuring the ink flowed properly despite the chill. Even sacred work required small adjustments to winter conditions. The smell inside such spaces would have been distinctive. A mixture of incense, charcoal, and aged wood created an atmosphere both contemplative and grounded. Warmth here was never overwhelming. It existed quietly alongside the cool air, encouraging stillness rather than relaxation. Architecture also played a role. Deep eaves protected buildings from snow, while raised floors allowed air circulation that prevented dampness. These features, useful year-round, became especially important in winter, when moisture could otherwise linger and intensify the sensation of cold. Some temple kitchens prepared large pots of hot gruel or tea shared among residents to sustain internal warmth during long hours of study or meditation. Communal eating mirrored domestic patterns, showing how practical needs crossed social boundaries. Scholars studying monastic life often debate how closely temple routines reflected those of surrounding communities. While religious institutions had their own rules, material culture suggests considerable overlap in how warmth was managed. You walk through a corridor where sunlight filters weakly through paper screens, illuminating drifting particles of smoke from a distant brazier. The stillness feels intentional, shaped by both design and season. In certain mountainous temples, snowfall could isolate residents for days, making preparation essential. Supplies were gathered in advance, and buildings were maintained carefully to withstand cold winds. Surviving documents describe these logistical efforts alongside spiritual duties. There is a quiet resilience in how these communities approached winter. Rather than seeking to eliminate discomfort, they acknowledged it and worked within its limits, using measured warmth to support daily life without distraction. As you pause beside a small source of heat in this imagined temple, you see that whether in a family home or a religious hall, the principles remain remarkably consistent. Warmth is concentrated, shared, and respected, and in that continuity between sacred and ordinary spaces, winter becomes another thread connecting all aspects of life in ancient Japan. As evening approaches, once more you begin to notice how strongly winter influences the rhythm of time itself. Without modern lighting to push back darkness, night arrives as a decisive presence. The sun sinks, temperatures follow, and households prefer to close in on themselves again, conserving both warmth and energy. You watch as activities gradually wind down. Tools are put away earlier than they might be in other seasons. Sliding shutters are drawn across openings to reduce drafts. The house becomes more enclosed, not sealed, but gently tightened against the growing cold. This adjustment to daylight is well documented in historical accounts that describe pre-modern life as deeply seasonal. Artificial illumination existed in the form of oil lamps or candles, yet these required fuel that was too valuable to waste. Winter evenings therefore encourage shorter waking hours and a more deliberate use of light. A lamp is lit now, its flame small but steady. Because shoji screens diffuse the glow, one source can illuminate much of the room. This efficient use of light reduces the need for additional flames, which in turn preserves precious oil or wax. You sit near the hearth, again noticing how darkness outside heightens the sense of warmth within. The contrast is part of the experience. Winter nights feel longer, not only because of reduced daylight, but because people allow them to be so. An unusual note from a provincial diary mentions families timing conversations or storytelling to coincide with the period when the fire was strongest, ensuring that social time aligned with available heat. Whether this was conscious planning or simple habit is unclear, but it reveals how closely warmth and daily schedule intertwined. The sounds of night are sparse. A distant dog barks, then silence returns. Inside, fabric shifts, charcoal settles, and someone pours another cup of tea. Each small noise feels amplified by the stillness. Scholars sometimes debate whether these long dark evenings contributed to the development of reflective arts such as poetry and calligraphy, which require little movement and can be practiced close to a fire. Others argue that artistic traditions follow broader cultural patterns unrelated to season. The question remains open, yet the setting certainly encourages contemplation. Preparing for sleep begins earlier as well. Bedding is arranged, clothing adjusted, and fires allowed to diminish gradually rather than being kept at full strength. Letting the temperature fall overnight conserves fuel for morning needs. You imagine how different this feels from a world where electric light extends activity indefinitely. Here, winter encourages rest, aligning human routine with environmental change rather than resisting it. There is also a protective aspect. Fewer active hours mean fewer opportunities for accidents with fire or tools in dim conditions. The season quietly enforces caution. In some communities, neighbours might check on one another during particularly cold nights, ensuring that elderly residents had sufficient fuel or supplies. These acts of mutual awareness rarely appear in official records, but are suggested by later oral traditions. You sit watching the final glow of the day fade beyond the paper screens. The house grows quieter, its warmth concentrated near the hearth, while the outer rooms cool. Time seems to slow measured not by clocks but by the gradual settling of embers. Historians studying seasonal life often emphasize that winter was not merely endured but structured. People reshaped their expectations, allowing darkness and cold to guide behavior instead of fighting them. And as the night deepens and the household prepares once more for layered sleep, you sense that managing time wisely was itself a powerful way to stay warm. If you needed to leave the safety of home during winter, you would not go empty-handed. Ancient Japanese travelers developed small portable ways to carry warmth with them, turning heat into something that could be transported rather than left behind. One of the most practical tools was the hibachi, a compact brazier filled with charcoal. Unlike the larger hearth, it could be placed beside a seated person, or even carried short distances. Metal or ceramic containers held the coals securely, allowing controlled warmth without open flames. Archaeological finds and illustrated scrolls confirm that such braziers were common in both domestic and official settings by the medieval period. You imagine sitting beside one during a journey's rest, extending your hands toward the contained glow. The heat is modest but focused, ideal for reviving cold fingers before continuing on. Travellers and officials sometimes used even smaller devices called hand warmers, essentially miniature charcoal containers designed to be held or tucked into sleeves. These objects allowed mobility while still offering relief from the chill. The principle is familiar today, though its origins reach back many centuries. A fascinating anecdote appears in some Edo period writings describing messengers carrying these warmers during long winter routes, carefully maintaining embers so that they would last the entire journey. Whether this was always successful is uncertain, but the attempt shows how valuable portable heat had become. You picture pausing along a roadside, opening such a container briefly to adjust the charcoal, then closing it again to preserve warmth. Even while travelling, fuel had to be managed thoughtfully. Clothing adapted to this mobility as hell. Layered robes allowed these small heat sources to be used safely without direct contact with skin. Sleeves and folds acted almost like insulated compartments. Some historians suggest that the development of portable heating reflected the increasing movement of people during certain periods, including officials, merchants, and samurai, who could not remain indoors throughout winter. Others believe such tools existed earlier in simpler forms that left little archaeological trace. Evidence remains fragmentary, leaving room for interpretation. You notice how these devices embody the same philosophy seen in homes. They do not attempt to create a warm environment everywhere. Instead, they create a small zone of comfort that moves with the individual. Even horses or pack animals benefited indirectly as travellers stopped more frequently to warm themselves, allowing animals to rest as well. Winter journeys became slower but more deliberate, shaped by the need to maintain heat and energy. The sensory experience of travel in cold weather would have been distinctive. The faint metallic scent of heated containers, the muffled crunch of frozen ground, and the brief, welcome touch of warmth during stops all formed part of the journey. In some regions, roadside shelters or tea houses offered a chance to replenish charcoal and share fires with others. Whether these were formal services or informal hospitality is still discussed among scholars, but they played an important role in sustaining winter movement. You adjust your imagined cloak, feeling how even a small brazier can transform the experience of cold air. Heat does not need to be constant to be effective. Intermittent warmth applied wisely can sustain endurance over long distances. As you continue along the path carrying this modest source of heat, you see how ancient travellers extended the same strategies of concentration and conservation beyond the home. And with each careful step through the winter landscape, warmth becomes not a place you remain in, but something you carry, protect and renew as you go. In regions where snowfall was heavy and persistent, staying warm also meant managing the physical weight and presence of snow itself. You might not immediately think of rooftops and pathways as part of thermal strategy, yet they played an essential role in winter survival. You stand outside again in your imagination, looking up at a farmhouse roof angled sharply towards the ground. This steep design helps snow slide off before it can accumulate and press dangerously on the structure. Architectural historians studying traditional villages have documented how roof pitch increased in areas with higher snowfall, reflecting practical adaptation rather than stylistic choice. Clearing snow was not simply about preventing collapse. Accumulated drifts could block sunlight, reduce ventilation, and introduce moisture that made interiors feel colder. By keeping roofs and entryways clear, residents had preserved both structural safety and a measure of environmental balance. You could almost hear the soft thud of snow being pushed aside with wooden tools, the sound absorbed by the white landscape. This work required steady effort, yet it also generated body heat, turning maintenance into another form of self-warming activity. In some communities, pathways between homes were maintained collectively, so that families could continue to share resources and fires. Cooperation reduced the need for each household to expend additional fuel or labour. Whether these practices were organised formally or arose through necessity is still debated among historians, but evidence suggests strong local collaboration. A curious custom mentioned in a few regional accounts describes stacking removed snow in deliberate patterns to act as windbreaks around buildings. These temporary barriers reduced exposure to icy gusts. While not universal, the idea shows how even snow itself could be repurposed as protection. Inside the house, entry areas were carefully managed to prevent melted snow from spreading dampness across tatami floors. Wet materials lose insulating ability quickly, so maintaining dryness was a constant concern. Shoes were removed, garments brushed off, and sometimes hung near the hearth to dry. You begin to notice how winter demanded attention to transitions between outdoors and indoors. Each return from the cold required small rituals of cleaning and warming to maintain the interior environment. Researchers studying climate adaptation often point to these habits as examples of behavioural engineering rather than technological change. Instead of inventing new machines, people refined routines that controlled moisture airflow and heat retention. Even storage areas were adjusted. Firewood and charcoal had to remain dry, so they were kept under shelter or elevated slightly above ground. Damp fuel supply could mean the difference between comfort and a long cold night. The landscape itself influenced perception. Snow reflected light into homes during the day, sometimes brightening interiors despite the season. This natural illumination reduced the need for lamps and conserved resources, an effect noted in several environmental studies of traditional settlements. You imagine looking out across a white field, the brightness almost luminous, then stepping back into the subdued warmth of the house. The contrast heightens awarenesses of both environments, making each feel more distinct. Some scholars suggest that these winter interactions with snow-shaped aesthetic appreciation seen later in art and poetry, where snowy scenes are depicted not only as harsh, but also as serene. Others argue that artistic themes cannot be traced so directly to daily labour. The discussion remains open, yet the lived experience certainly left an impression. As evening approaches again and pathways are cleared for the night, you see how managing snow was inseparable from managing warmth. Winter was not just an atmosphere pressing inward. It was a material presence to be moved, shaped and negotiated so that life inside could remain steady and secure. When you settle back indoors after the work of managing snow and cold, you begin to notice something more subtle than architecture or clothing. Winter has a sensory world all its own, one that shapes how warmth is perceived even when temperatures remain low. The house is filled with quiet sounds that would be easy to miss in other seasons. Charcoal shifts softly in the hearth. Fabric brushes against tatami as someone moves. A kettle hums before it begins to steam. Without the chorus of insects or the rush of summer rain, these small noises become the dominant texture of daily life. You sit still and listen. The absence of sound outside, especially after snowfall, creates a kind of acoustic insulation. Snow absorbs echoes, making the interior seem calmer and more contained. This natural hush may have contributed to the reflective atmosphere often associated with Japanese winter scenes, though historians caution that emotional interpretations are difficult to verify from material evidence alone. The smell inside is distinctive as well. Warm straw from the tatami, faint smoke from charcoal and the clean dryness of winter air combine into a scent that signals shelter. Unlike heavier wood fires, charcoal produces little odour, allowing other subtle fragrances to remain noticeable. In some households, dried herbs or incense were occasionally warmed near the hearth, adding gentle aromas believed to refresh the air. Whether used primarily for comfort or health is still debated among researchers, but such practices show how sensory experience was deliberately shaped. Light behaves differently too. It is softer filtered through shoji and reflected from pale winter skies. Even at midday, illumination feels diffused, encouraging slower movement and quieter activity. You notice how touch becomes especially important. Hands extended toward a brazier, sleeves drawn over fingers, the texture of layered cloth against skin. Warmth is rarely overwhelming, so it is felt in increments, appreciated precisely because it is modest. A small detail recorded in one historical account mentions people warming writing brushes near the fire so that bristles would remain flexible. This tiny adjustment reminds you how many aspects of life required attention to temperature, even those we might not immediately consider. Modern scholars sometimes describe these layered sensory cues as creating a psychological adaptation to winter, though measuring such experiences across centuries is challenging. The idea suggests that comfort came not only from physical heat, but from an environment that encouraged calm awareness. You watch as someone pours hot tea again, the steam briefly visible in the cool air before fading. That visual reminder of warmth, fleeting yet tangible, reinforces the sense that heat is something to be cherished rather than taken for granted. The textures around you also play a role. Wood retains a gentle resilience under your hands. Paper screens feel cool but never harsh. Even the roughness of straw cloaks drying nearby adds to the tactile landscape. In a world without mechanical heating, perception itself becomes part of survival. Recognizing warmth in small forms helps the body relax and conserve energy while sudden chills are managed through movement or layering. Some historians propose that this sensitivity to seasonal atmosphere influenced broader cultural expressions of subtlety and restraint. Others argue that such interpretations risk projecting modern ideas onto the past. The debate continues, yet the lived environment undeniably encouraged attentiveness. As evening settles again and the house returns to its familiar circle of firelight and shadow, you realise that winter here is experienced not just as temperature but as a complete sensory condition, and within that quiet textured world, warmth is felt most clearly in the smallest details. Over time, living so closely with the rhythms of winter did more than shape habits. It influenced how people thought about the season itself. Rather than viewing cold only as an obstacle, many came to see it as something to observe, even appreciate, a perspective that appears again and again in literature and art. You sit near the hearth while someone recites a short poem, its imagery describing frost on grasses or the stillness of a snowy field. Classical Japanese poetry, especially from the Heian period, often included seasonal references as essential elements. Winter scenes were not merely descriptive. They conveyed mood time and awareness of change. This literary convention is well documented in surviving anthologies where seasonal imagery structured entire collections. The environment you have been experiencing provided the sensory foundation for those lines. The quiet rooms, the filtered light, and the careful cultivation of warmth made people especially attentive to small changes outside. You imagine looking through a slightly opened screen at snow resting on tree branches, noticing how even a thin layer transforms the landscape. Such moments required no travel or elaborate preparation. Observation itself became an activity suited to cold weather. Some scholars argue that this attentiveness to seasonal transition contributed to aesthetic values, emphasizing impermanence and subtle beauty. Others caution that philosophical interpretations evolved independently of climate, shaped more by court culture and religious ideas. The relationship remains debated, yet the connection between lived environment and artistic expression feels difficult to ignore. Inside creative activities required little movement, making them ideal for winter. Writing, painting, or playing music could be done close to the hearth without consuming extra fuel. Cultural production and thermal efficiency aligned naturally. A charming historical anecdote describes courtiers competing to compose the most evocative winter verse while seated together for warmth, turning shared discomfort into inspiration. Whether playful or serious, it shows how creativity could flourish under such conditions. Even visual arts reflect this seasonal awareness. Later painted screens often depict snow-covered villages with figures gathered around fires, scenes that echo the daily realities you have been imagining. These works were not fantasies but stylized reflections of ordinary endurance. You notice how the atmosphere encourages introspection. Without the distractions of louder seasons, attention turns inward. Conversations grow softer, thoughts linger longer. The physical stillness imposed by cold fosters mental wandering. Researchers studying cultural history sometimes propose that winter provided an annual pause in which reflection became possible, though measuring this effect across different classes and regions is challenging. Evidence varies and conclusions remain tentative, yet it is easy to see how evenings spent near a small source of warmth with limited light and few external demands would create space for storytelling or contemplation. You sip another cup of tea, feeling again that combination of internal heat and external chill. The balance itself seems to invite awareness. Neither extreme dominates, instead each defines the other. Seasonal festivals also acknowledged winter's presence, marking transitions through ritual rather than attempting to overcome them. Observances tied to the lunar calendar reminded communities that cold was a temporary part of a repeating cycle. Some historians suggest these rituals reinforced resilience by framing hardship within predictable patterns. Others believe they primarily served symbolic or religious functions. The practical and the spiritual were often intertwined, making clear distinctions difficult. As you sit listening to quiet voices and watching embers settle, you understand that winter in ancient Japan shaped not only how people stayed warm, but how they understood time, beauty, and endurance. And in that understanding, the season became less an adversary and more a companion that returned each year to be met with preparation, patience, and attention. As centuries passed, small innovations began to appear, subtle changes that hinted at future developments while still remaining rooted in long-established practices. Winter life did not suddenly transform, but gradual refinements made certain tasks easier and comfort slightly more attainable. You notice, for example, that tools and household items became more specialized over time. Braziers were crafted in sturdier forms, sometimes decorated yet still functional, allowing safer use inside homes. Metalworking improvements meant containers could hold heat more efficiently without cracking. Archaeological studies of later medieval sites reveal a growing variety of such implements, suggesting an ongoing process of adaptation rather than a single technological leap. Clothing too evolved. As cotton cultivation spread more widely across Japan during the late medieval and early modern periods, padded garments became increasingly common. Cotton could be quilted, washed, and repaired more easily than earlier materials, offering better insulation for ordinary people. Economic historians often point to this shift as one of the most significant changes in everyday winter comfort. You imagine wearing such a garment heavier than earlier layers, but also softer and more consistent in warmth. Yet even with this improvement, the broader system remained the same. Houses were still airy, heat was still localized. Innovation supplemented tradition rather than replacing it. A curious example of incremental change appears in records describing charcoal graded by quality and intended use, with finer varieties reserved for indoor heating because they produced less smoke and lasted longer. This level of classification suggests an increasingly sophisticated understanding of fuel management. Some scholars argue that these refinements indicate rising standards of domestic life, while others caution that evidence is uneven and often reflects urban centres more than rural realities. The pace of change likely varied greatly across regions. You also see adjustments in storage and preparation. Better containers kept fuel dry. More durable roofing materials reduced maintenance. Even small efficiencies repeated daily added up to noticeable differences over a season. Despite these advances, the fundamental philosophy of winter living did not shift toward conquering cold entirely. Large-scale heating systems never became central to traditional architecture. Instead, people continue to rely on layering shared spaces and carefully tended fires. This continuity fascinates modern researchers who study why certain technologies emerge in some cultures and not others. Some suggest that environmental balance, seismic activity, and available materials all favoured lighter structures over massive heated buildings. Others emphasise cultural preference for flexibility and seasonal awareness. The debate remains ongoing. You sense that innovation here followed a path of harmony, rather than disruption. Each improvement fit within existing patterns, enhancing them without demanding radical change. Even decorative arts reflected winter practicality. Thick textiles designed for beauty also provided insulation when hung or folded nearby. Objects served more than one purpose, blending aesthetics and utility. An anecdote from a merchant's journal mentions customers evaluating charcoal braziers not only for warmth, but for how gracefully they suited the interior of a room. Function and appearance were rarely separated. As you watch the quiet efficiency of these evolving tools and materials, you realise that progress does not always mean abandoning older ways. Sometimes it means refining them, polishing what already works. And so winter life in Japan moved forward slowly, guided by experience rather than urgency, preserving a balance that allowed comfort to grow without losing the careful awareness that had sustained generations. You find yourself once more seated near the steady glow of the hearth, aware now of how many different choices, habits, and materials have quietly worked together to create this moment of comfort. Nothing you have seen relied on overwhelming force or grand invention. Instead, winter in ancient Japan was met with patience, preparation, and an understanding that warmth could be gathered piece by piece. The house still breathes gently with the outside air. Layers of clothing still hold pockets of heat close to the body. Tea steams softly in a bowl. Snow rests beyond the screens present, but no longer intrusive. Each element participates in a system refined over centuries, one that values balance more than domination. Historical studies of pre-modern Japanese life often emphasize this adaptive approach, noting how architecture, clothing, and daily routine aligned with seasonal change rather than attempting to erase it. The strategy proved remarkably sustainable, allowing communities to endure cold winters using limited fuel and renewable materials. You think about the ingenuity of charcoal makers, the weaving of straw cloaks, the careful arrangement of futon, and the shared space around a kotatsu. None of these solutions were extravagant, all of them were intentional. A small anecdote from a later rural memoir describes an elder reminding younger family members each autumn to prepare early, saying that winter comfort depended more on autumn diligence than winter effort. Whether the quote is literal or polished through retelling, it captures a truth visible throughout everything you have experienced. Scholars still discuss how much these practices shaped broader cultural attitudes toward nature and resilience. Some see them as evidence of a worldview centered on coexistence with the environment. Others argue they were simply practical responses to material conditions. The interpretation remains open, yet the lived reality speaks clearly enough. You notice now how calm the room feels. Warmth exists, but it is gentle, never overwhelming. The cold outside has not been defeated, it has been acknowledged, negotiated, and given its place. This balance may be the most enduring lesson. Instead of building barriers against the season, people created relationships with it. Fires were tended rather than unleashed. Clothing adapted rather than sealed. Homes allowed air to pass rather than locking it out. Survival came through attentiveness. As the evening settles into quiet, the household's movements slow. Someone adjusts the coals, another folds a garment for tomorrow. These actions repeat patterns followed countless times before linking present comfort to generations of experience. The sensory world grows softer. Light dims, sounds fade. Warmth lingers in fabric, in wood, in memory, more than in temperature alone. And now, as this winter day gently comes to a close, the pace of everything eases further. You remain seated, breathing slowly, aware of the steady presence of heat near you and the vast cool night beyond the walls. There is no urgency here. The season moves at its own rhythm and you move with it. The fire lowers to a quiet glow, no longer a focal point but a companion. The room darkens, shapes softening into shadow. Outside, snow reflects faint light from the sky, while inside, layers of cloth and wood hold just enough warmth to be comforting. You feel the weight of the day settle not heavily, but like another blanket drawn gently into place. The knowledge that people lived this way for centuries becomes reassuring rather than distant. They endured not by resisting winter, but by learning its patterns so well that cold became familiar. Your breathing slows with the stillness. The environment asks nothing more of you now. The careful systems of layering, sharing, and tending have done their work. In this quiet balance between warmth and chill, effort and rest, you can let your thoughts drift just as countless others once did beside similar fires, listening to the same soft sounds of charcoal and night. And as everything fades into calm, winter no longer feels harsh. It feels steady, predictable, almost protective in its silence. Sweet dreams.